doing
Shh,
something.
your mic's open. Oh, hey, we're back.
Hello.
We're back. We're live, coming to you from the hottest place that you don't get to sin in order to get to. Unfortunately, it's like we get the heat without the naughty parts.
What naughty parts?
The things that make
mind.
you to go to the hot place.
Sorry. Okay.
Being too obscure. So, good evening.
Good evening.
We're here to talk to you about something kind of interesting we discovered.
Sure.
What happened was last June, we went to Manchester, England.
Mm-hmm.
And what this is a very elaborate way of getting people to look at our vacation photos. All right.
Well, and while we were there, Jerry, of course, brought the equipment, and we shot some footage that I was going to use in my lecture at school, but we decided, what the heck, let's put together a program.
Because we found out that this is very sweeping. Now, we're going to talk about Peterloo, or the Peterloo Massacre, which is a loaded expression.
Yep.
So tell us about what happened when we got there, what we found at this square.
Sure. When we got to an area that's marked as Peter's Field in the middle of Manchester, there's a giant convention center, there's a large area of cement, and then there was a marked off area over in the corner, and it announced that this was the upcoming monument for the 200th anniversary of the Peterloo Massacre, which happened on August 16th, 1819.
And I didn't know anything about it. You did, of course.
We did. I knew a little bit about it. I knew it was a big massacre that happened during the Industrial Revolution, but not much more of it. I got to admit, sometimes I cut it out of my lecture because I didn't know anything about it. So we started researching while we were there. Because it was the 200th anniversary, the public library, there was an archival library, and the Museum of Science and Technology, and also the People's
Museum, which is an interesting story in itself.
Very left-leaning museum, all had displays on this, and everyone was going quite crazy about Peterloo and what happened. So we decided to dig in and find out a little bit more about it. But I think we should let the video speak for itself.
So we've put together a little video that we shot there. This is going to run about 14 and a half minutes. We'll still be here. You can still make your comments in the live chat, and we'll respond. If anybody is tuning in later, we will also post this separately onto the YouTube channel as a separate item.
Yeah.
So
you don't have to sit through the full hour of this.
And the bad introductions and so on. All right. So let's press this.
All right.
And this. In 1819, the British aristocracy was scared spitless. Relax, I said spitless. America had just had a revolution and broken away one of the wealthiest colonies of the United Kingdom. France had had a violent revolution. Thousands had died. A tyrant had taken over. Ireland had declared its independence, and only through really ruthless responses was it suppressed. The aristocracy was threatened. The world was changing. The world was becoming industrial, and aristocracy was based on agriculture.
We're in Manchester, which now looks like a very modern city. It's actually the second largest city in England. And it was the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, right here.
Behind me are the first really great factories. These were mills. This building and a whole series beyond there held hundreds, sometimes thousands of people working in sweatshop conditions at the beginning of the 19th century. And what happened here would create the modern world. Factories were built here. The textile industry came of its own here. Endless inventions and innovations came here. We had the development of the factory system. We had mass workers at the same time as people were driven off their lands. So we had a change in the entire social structure. It's a revolution. It's called that for a reason. But the aristocracy wanted that control. They passed laws like the corn laws. In the United Kingdom, corn is wheat, and what we call corn in the United States is something they call maize. But the corn laws put tariffs on imported goods so that they cost more, so that people had to buy grain at a certain price from the domestic growers. meaning that it was making the rich people who owned land even richer. High prices of grain were ruinous for the people in urban areas. So the people in the farms, who owned the farms, who did grow the crops, wanted the tariffs so that they could make the maximum amount of money. And the people in the cities wanted lower prices and no tariffs so that they could afford to eat.
The poor people who increasingly worked in factories here in Manchester and in cities like it, they couldn't afford the grain. And the people reached out to their representative government. They contacted their member of parliament, but, oh wait, they didn't have one.
The representative districts for the House of Commons were set up by tradition in the 17th and 18th centuries. They were represented by tradition, not by population. They had what they called rotten boroughs, in that you would only have a handful of voters, literally 7 voters, for something like 11 representatives. Meanwhile, a brand new city like Manchester that had exploded into a population of over 400,000 during the early Industrial Revolution, they had 2 representatives. And so it truly was representation, taxation, and laws being made without anybody here in this urban area having a say.
What is freedom ye can tell, that which slavery is too well, for its very name has grown to an echo of your own. 'Tis to work and have such pay as just keeps life from day to day. 'Tis to see your children weak with their mothers pine and peak when the winter winds are bleak. They are dying whilst I speak. 'Tis to be a slave in soul and to hold no strong control over your own wills, but be all that others make of ye. No, in countries that are free, such starvation cannot be, as in England now we see.
So the reform movement grew out of a great number of frustrations. Some of them frustrations about the tariffs and the corn laws, some of them frustrations about representation, some of them frustrations about the working conditions that were here.
The people were motivated by posters, flyers, handbills, including this one.
Let no good man enroll himself to cut his starving neighbor's throat at the command of any tyrant whatsoever.
But notice this section.
As the American laborer can earn a bushel of wheat equal to 9 or 10 shillings per day, let every man who cannot earn that sum, which our oppressive system alone prevents, keep out of the tyrant's core, and the success of the people is sure.
Could a British working person make as much money and live as well as an American? To do that, they wanted American-style democracy. Well, that's pretty threatening to the upper class, too.
One of the answers of how to fix this was to allow more people to vote. Get rid of the rule that you had to own so much land to vote, and allow more people to vote. They called it universal suffrage. Now, universal in terms of every man getting the vote, women getting the vote, was still a very long way off.
Even in America in 1819, not every man was guaranteed the right to vote. In several states, you had to own property. The people wanted to change, and they called for democracy. And this is where they gathered.
On August 16th of 1819, a meeting was called for this exact spot.
They brought in Henry Hunt, who was a popular, passionate speaker from the south of England, who came to speak to these people, to call for their cry of one man, one vote. For the record, even in 1819, there were some people who said one person, one vote. They were in the minority.
People from all over were expecting to come that day, from villages miles away. They had made flags. They were wearing special outfits for it. They elected wardens, men who would be in charge of their group, and they trained in nonviolent protest. They didn't call it that then. They just were not going to fight. They were going to come here and ask for representation.
Let a vast assembly be, and with great solemnity declare with measured words that ye are as God has made ye free. Be your strong and simple words, keen to wound as sharpened swords.
In this area, Peter's Field, they figure about 60,000 people showed up for this event.
The land gentry were terrified.
The city fathers, according to what they said, were in a window probably somewhere over here. The building's no longer there. And the idea was to read the riot act, get the people out of here, and arrest Hunt and the leaders of this protest.
Speakers were standing on a couple of wagons addressing the crowd. The local constabulary, which was volunteers, they didn't have police the way we do, so the local constabulary rode in on horseback trying to arrest Henry Hunt.
And so they started to fight their way forward.
There were 60,000 people in the way.
Some of the people in the crowd stood in front of the constables to try to stop them. It wouldn't have been so bad, but they were in full uniform with their sabers and on horseback, and they charged the crowd.
You're on a horse, he's on a wagon, you have a sword. It didn't end well.
With sabers slashing as they went, totally unarmed people.
Let the horsemen's scimitars wheel and flash like fearless stars, thirsting to eclipse their burning in a sea of death and mourning. Stand ye calm and resolute, like a forest close and mute, with folded arms and look which are of unvanquished war.
Over 700 were wounded, and somewhere between 15 and 16 people were killed on the spot. Henry Hunt, of course, was arrested and spent 2 years in prison. Some of the wardens who had trained for nonviolent protest were also arrested and spent time in prison.
The public reaction to the events of Peterloo was extreme. The media, the global media, made an issue about what happened in Manchester. Everybody paid attention.
There had been reporters who were here who saw what had actually happened. In fact, one would go on to create one of the world's great newspapers, the Manchester Guardian, where he initially started it to talk about what happened here. So the stories grew into directions. It was the people in charge saying that it had been a mob riot, and they were right in putting it down, and the people who had been there and had peaceably assembled who wanted to get their reforms known. Their reforms were not listened to. In fact, it got worse. The Parliament put into act the 6 Acts.
By this time, the United Kingdom had a Bill of Rights, which was established in law. And many of these acts violated the Bill of Rights. But you did what you did because you wanted to maintain that power.
So these very onerous 6 Acts are going to tamp down this reform movement, but it had already started. The journalists tried to tie this into the Battle of Waterloo, where the Great Britain had defeated the French. And so they combined the words Waterloo and Peter's Field, and they came up with Peterloo. And this became known as the Peterloo Massacres. In 1819, there are no phones, there are no cameras, there are no recording devices of any kind. Our primary sources of the time include handbills, include newspaper reports, and of course include eyewitness testimony, much of which comes from the trial of Henry Hunt himself. The primary documents are really problematic and can be interpreted many different ways, and this is part of the struggle for historians. How do we tell this story? And of course, if you've got a story that certain people don't want you to tell, that's also problematic.
One of the people who paid attention was a young man named Percy Bysshe Shelley, better known as Mary's husband. Percy Shelley wrote a passionate poem, which is still repeated today, that changed the way we look at the world.
and that slaughter to the nation shall steam up like inspiration, eloquent oracular, a volcano heard afar. And these words shall then become like oppression, thunder, doom, ringing through each heart and brain, heard again, 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 rise like lions after slumber, in unvanquishable number, shake your chains to earth like dew, which in sleep had fallen on you. Ye are many, they are few.
The legacy of Peterloo is what we make it. You can choose to remember Peterloo as the aristocracy struggling to retain power in England. You can view Peterloo as the people coming together in one of the first mass demonstrations in the English-speaking world. You can view it as a transition to true representative democracy, not just for England, but really for the whole world, taking into account poor working people, difficult conditions, true representation in government, which was still new even in America. Or you can look at it as a bunch of rowdy people who had to be put down. How you look at it is up to you. But one thing I can really emphasize here, protests are never popular at the time. People are always taking controversial positions, and people will always object.
Today, most of the world has never even heard of Peterloo, but the power of nonviolent resistance has transformed the lives of millions, and the words of Shelley, celebrating that power, have been recited by striking garment workers, Mohandas Gandhi, the demonstrators at Tiananmen Square, and countless others.
And if I may, I'd like to quote one of my favorite poets, Percy Bysshe Shelley. Rise like lions after slumber, in unvanquishable number. Shake your chains to earth like dew, which in sleep had fallen on you. Ye are many, they are few.
So what would the people of 1819 think when they look around at this very modern city? The field that they were on, the field of Peterloo, is now a convention center. Instead of the crowded, smoky tenements, they now live in gorgeous glass skyscrapers. And the things they fought for that day, the reforms they asked for, they got. And then some. Their world that they saw becomes our world that is so much better, so much cleaner, so much more comfortable. And I think they'd be very proud of the fact that Manchester is still one of the great industrial centers of the world and an innovation center. It is in Manchester that they discovered in 2004 graphene, the world's thinnest substance, and they still make it here. The textile looms create fiberglass, not just clothes. And so there are things worth fighting for. I don't think in 1819 they understood how far they could go.
Okay, that was kind of long. There are a couple of items I'd like to comment on in that video, partly because we did this on the spur of the moment, whipping out the camera. Let's stand here. This looks really cool. Number one, where we were standing, which is the Manchester Central, it's now a conference center. It was a train station for 75 years. It's technically across the street from where the actual event was.
It's actually a periphery of where the actual event was. Right after the actual event, that field was all of a sudden used to build very large hotels and warehouses on. In fact, the city fathers tried to make it disappear in people's imagination.
The response to Peterloo is something we're going to talk about a little bit, I hope, over the course of this. And again, remember, we do have to get out by a certain time, we've promised.
Yes, we promised.
But, the Prince... Britain did not have a sane king at this time. This was the Regency. George III was, sorry. But the Prince Regent sent a letter to the constables thanking them for their decorum and well-mannered response, well-mannered and appropriate to the riffraff in Peterloo. I also wanted to mention that, yes, We have a clip of Jeremy Corbyn in there, partly because they have totally adopted the Shelley poem, which was written in response to Peterloo. I do not want to come off as endorsing Jeremy Corbyn or the Labour Party,
Right.
where you can't vote over there. So really what we say doesn't matter, but anybody but Bojo, okay? Sorry, that's my opinion.
Anyway.
So a couple other things to cover here real briefly. Well, not real briefly. We got 40 minutes to talk. So I wanted to talk also about voting for a second, because voting was done, technically they say 5% of the people could vote. I assume that means 5% of the population, probably 10% of the men could vote.
Right.
But you basically, these sections were set up very strangely. And I actually have a picture here that I want to show because this is really cool, of a voting place. So you voted for the House of Commons. Now, Manchester is in the county of Lancashire, and you had to go to the city of Lancaster and vote in person. And this is a painting done of one of these polling places where you basically walked into a bar and they gathered around. This is the Roman system. This is pretty much the way the Romans voted. So you showed up and they said, how are you going to vote? And you said, well, I'm voting for my landlord.
Yes.
I don't know why. I just think
Yeah.
my landlord is a really good choice at this time.
They were not secret ballots at all. You had to announce who you were voting for out loud, and you know the people you were voting for and or against were standing right there.
Or they had their friend. I mean,
or they had their friends with brickbats standing there.
Technically, Manchester didn't really have any representatives.
Right,
All
the city
of
itself.
Lancashire, which is an entire region that goes from, I believe, from Liverpool all the way up to Lancaster. It's a big enough chunk of northwestern England had 2 representatives.
Right.
This was changed eventually, but
It took a long time.
it took a long time, and there was a lot of resistance to one man, one vote.
Right. And Manchester had started out at the beginning of the 19th century as a town of 20,000, and it expanded until the end of the century. It had over 500,000 people in it. That's a huge number of people to bring into a city. And of course, that created some of the worst living conditions you can possibly ever imagine.
I was about to talk more about voting. We'll go straight into
talk
voting.
more about voting.
This is an anti-universal suffrage cartoon that appeared. It basically says, universal suffrage, the scum rises to the top. This was basically circulated saying this is why we don't want to vote for universal suffrage. Now, I'm sorry. Misha, Dr. Misha for you, is sticking better to our outline than I was. We were going to talk a little about conditions.
Right.
How bad was it?
How bad was it? Well, let me pull out. Great book, by the way, if you want to find out more about the Industrial Revolution in Victorian cities. It's Asa Briggs' Victorian Cities. He's a top-notch historian. But he found in his book, he lists the nice little chart, average age of death per classification. And he's comparing the towns of Manchester and Rutlandshire, which is in the country. So, professional persons and gentry and their families, this is the middle class, upper middle class, farmers, etc. In Manchester, the average age of death was 38. In Rutlandshire, the average age of death was 52. For tradesmen and their families, the average age of death in years in Manchester was 20. The average age of death in Rutlandshire for those people was 41, twice as long. Mechanics, laborers, and their families, the average age of death in Manchester was 17. The average age of death in Rutlandshire, 38.
Okay.
That's how bad it was.
So one of the things we had was, I'm assuming many of these mills were actually running on steam and coal.
They start out running by water power.
But there were so many.
Water winds. But then once we get steam engines up and running, then you don't have to have those factories right on the water.
So
there's more land to spread out.
Tremendous amount of pollution.
Oh, yeah.
I'm surprised nobody referred to this as dark satanic mills.
Actually, they did. For one thing, Thomas Carlyle, who was writing quite extensively at the time, talks about the rivers in Manchester flowing black like ink, and the skies being completely covered in coal dust.
Okay, yeah, conditions were terrible. People died early, but one of the reasons why people died early was because they had children working in the mills. Let's talk for a second about what happened. The revolution, and the Industrial Revolution is utterly amazing. Oops, that's not the image I wanted. For thousands, that is a spinning mill.
That is a spinning jenny.
That's actually a mule.
A spinning mule, yeah. That is spinning bobbins of cotton thread that are going to be used in the weaving process. So this is not, they're not even weaving yet. These are just making thousands of bobbins of cotton thread that are going to then be fed into the looms to be woven. But these machines, these mules, moved back and forth to put the right tension on.
We have a video we're going to show in a second.
Right.
But why is that child back there? They wouldn't let children in the factory, would they?
Children were allowed in the factory. In fact, in some circumstances, like factories who had these kind of mules, spinning mules, they were welcomed because they were small and could get underneath these pieces of machinery.
I think welcomed is the wrong word.
Yeah.
They gathered up orphans, and I did not realize until we got there that orphan is a euphemism.
Right.
Go ahead.
Orphan didn't always mean that your parents were dead. Orphan often meant that children were abandoned.
Yeah. So a guy knocks up a young woman.
Right.
She has to live in shame. What are you going to do with the factory? She wants to eat. She gets a job.
She gets a job in the factory.
In the factory. The kids are often on the street corners. Right. And they were rounded up by these factory owners, and they were put to work as, I'm going to use the word slaves.
Real close to it, but they were there to crawl underneath them fast-moving machinery to pick up scraps so that they didn't get involved.
Because they would fit back in there. And if they misbehaved, they were beaten. If they tried to run away, they were hunted down and they were beaten. It was a terrible life. So that machine that you saw replaced this, which had existed for thousands of years.
Right. Spinning thread was women's work, generally made out of wool, flax, or cotton. They didn't spin it very tightly, but it was good enough for the kinds of fabric that they made. But a woman spinning like this could only make so many yards of this yarn or this thread a day, and then it would have to be knitted or woven into a piece of cloth.
So here is the machine that replaced this. This is
here it is working.
Now, in a factory, you had row after row after row of these, and floor after floor after floor of these.
They are noisy. They had to be minded. You had to stick your fingers into there and tie up thread as quickly as you possibly could. They're wonders of design. They are amazing. You can watch this for hour after hour after hour. But underneath those threads, that's where the kids would run around picking up the scraps. Obviously, this factory floor doesn't have the scraps.
This is in a museum in southern Scotland. As I said, we found a way to make other people look at our vacation pictures.
Right. But more importantly, what's happening in these mills is not just innovation with equipment. When spinning and weaving was done by hand by people at homes, and they did it on their own time, at their own speed, when they felt like it, and occasionally had more cloth to give away to friends or to sell at the market. But it was all inside their own timing, inside their own ability. With weaving, of course, it's an extremely complex sort of system. It's one of the very first crafts that are mechanized, and it makes very good sense.
Okay.
But what I'm saying is this: with the factories, instead of making one bobbin at a time, you saw they're making hundreds of bobbins at a time. But the machine's doing it, and the machine is running at a certain pace, and that pace is dependent upon who sets the pace for the rest of the machinery, because everything's tied together in an axle system that's being run by either a water wheel or later on steam engines. The workers were there not as skilled workers to make cloth. They didn't know all of the steps it took to make cloth. They were de-skilled. They were there to serve the machine. And that was basically the idea of alienation. They are alienated from the process because they do not own or control the means of production. And if you think I'm talking Marx, I'm talking Marx.
Well, you're talking Marx, but it's not like Marx had a co-author who ran a mill in Manchester.
You mean Friedrich Engels?
Friedrich Engels, no, he was after the time that we were talking about. He moved to Manchester in about 1840, I believe.
Right.
And he was shocked by the conditions. His family was very disappointed that he didn't want to be more mercenary. But communism definitely has a connection to here. Socialism has a much stronger connection, but in its definition in the 19th century, at this time, it was very different than what came to mean later. I wanted to address a couple of questions that we've got in the live chat.
Oh, questions. Cool.
One of them was a comment from Robert, I assume that's Fried. Cotton gained from the slaves in the American antebellum South Civil War. Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
This was actually part of why Britain wanted to come into the war on the side of the South, because they were worried about upsetting that cotton supply.
Right. But Britain... This is also why Britain spread out, can you say imperialism, spread out to places like Egypt and India. India had its own cotton growing system before the British and the Dutch tried to take it over. The Indians spun their own cotton, wove their own materials, dyed it. This is where Madras comes from. This is where a whole seersucker. This is where a whole range of cotton fabrics came from. And Great Britain worked very, very hard to get rid of the labor part of making the cloth, but make sure that they all grew the cotton. So basically, Great Britain tried to take away that whole manufacturing thing, or we would be talking about India as the leader of the Industrial
There is
Revolution.
actually a show that we've talked about doing on why India is not
an industrial leader.
I think it probably will be. It probably will. Okay.
Yeah.
There's another question that came from Aqua Groundhog. What happens when the child gets stuck in there? And I appreciate your concern, but really they could always find another child. They could keep the machines running. That wasn't really something that they worried about. Sorry.
Those machines literally had no safety guards. They wanted them accessible so that people could get in there and do their work.
I'm guessing that the death of a lot of 8-year-olds probably helped pull that average down.
Yeah. But there were a lot of moving parts, a lot of ways to get your fingers stuck in it. Losing a finger, not unusual. Getting your hair stuck in the machine, and there's reports of people having their scalps ripped off because of these machines, and getting your clothes caught. When you see the pictures of the women in these factories, they're wearing long dresses and
because
aprons,
that's what you do.
because that's how they dressed. Actually,
this is a much later picture of conditions, obviously, but still, the point is, this is probably taken in the early 20th century, the late 19th century, but things hadn't changed all that much.
But there are not these safety stop buttons that you can hit those buttons and hopefully get the machine to stop. And if you stopped these machines, you were in big trouble.
Well, yeah, because it stops everything.
It stops everything.
So children were a central part of this, but one of the things that we've got, which leads up to Peterloo, and it's really, really important, is you had this philosophical moment that developed in the late 18th century with
the Age of Enlightenment.
The Age of Enlightenment. You had Jeremy Bentham,
right?
John Stuart Mill. John Locke was a little earlier.
Mills is a little a little later.
Right.
He worked
Anyway.
with Bentham. Anyway, you had a lot of people starting to question the basic morality of this. You had Rousseau, who was in France, who basically said,
Yeah.
the whole problem is private property. We get rid of private property, we don't have these things.
Right.
Britain had its answer in Edmund Burke, who said, no, private property and class distinctions is what builds a society.
And that's what we should have government for, is to protect this private property.
And this distinction obviously continues to this very day of these two different ways of looking at things in class, having more property to rule, having a requirement to have land to vote.
But these kind of attitudes, Edmund Burke's attitudes, only worked for people who had property, had businesses, had a way of earning their living through their own work. We're in the middle class, and the Industrial Revolution creates the middle class in Britain and then in the rest of Europe. But if you didn't have that, but if you were a farmer who had lost his land because the rent was too high, if you were a laborer who needed a job and had gone to the city, there was very little that you could do other than go to work for a wage. And you cannot get rich, in most cases, going to work for a wage. As Frederick Engel explained it, it was people who spent today what they earned yesterday.
Well, I thought the Shelley poem, which I'm really fond of, talks about that. What is freedom? That which slavery is, you know too well. 'Tis to work and have such pay as just to live from day to day. I think it's really powerful, and it's one of the reasons why, as I said, Gandhi has quoted it. Many other people have adopted it. But we had this attitude growing of rights of different people.
Right.
You had the French Revolution not long before, which declared the rights of man and the citizen.
Right. But England had already had its Bill of Rights.
Yes, 1689.
1688, 1689.
Yeah, okay.
But those were not being protected. It's one thing to announce you have these rights. It's another thing to have them protected.
The first labor union in the history of the world was founded in Manchester in 1818.
Right.
Which is a year before Peterloo. Now, not too much happened. It did not succeed.
And many of the trade unions wanted to make sure that they were only protecting certain people. They ranked workers by what their skills were or what they were capable of doing. That lasted into the 20th
century.
Yes. And if you didn't match up to those levels, you were not allowed in the union. They did not negotiate for you as much as they could. And so unions had a very difficult time, but they were also very interested in keeping some people out.
Yeah, and that's always been the case. Unions, well, not always, but that certainly was the case for many years in America. The unions had a racist history that we don't like to talk about. But, okay, so people did not like living in harsh conditions and not having a vote. There were a number of riots all over the United Kingdom at this point. There had been a put down in Scotland.
Right. For voting rights?
No, this was guys who were, this is a draft that was, people were supposed to.
Okay, that was a draft riot. You also had the Luddites. Yeah. Ned Ludd, the people who were trying to break the looms, break these pieces of equipment. Parliament had made breaking equipment
punishable by death.
A capital offense.
This is a picture of Ned Ludd, the founder of the Luddites. He would lead people all over the countryside, burning factories and terrorizing things, which is really impressive for somebody who didn't exist.
Yeah, he was amazing for a fictional character. But the Luddites used Ned Ludd as kind of their
The term Luddite appears to have existed before this time. But so Ned Ludd became almost a code word, a character. Curiously, the Luddites started about 60 miles away from Manchester in Nottingham, which is the same place where another fictional guy who destroyed
Robin Hood.
Love it. Just curious. But the Luddites were a very real threat. There were 17 people executed for destroying machinery in England in the very early 19th century. So I wanted to cover some of that because that's the setup to this gathering.
Right.
At Peter's Field.
At Peter's Field. You had people who had been planning it and who were working with Henry Hunt. Never forget, this is part of Henry Hunt's political career.
Well, Henry Hunt, who I'm sure very few people in our audience have ever heard of before, I certainly hadn't, but Henry Hunt was an orator. He was sometimes referred to as Orator Hunt. And
at this time, this was something people would do for entertainment. Oh, Henry Hunt's coming to town. Oh, let's go listen.
Let's go listen to him.
But he later ran for Parliament. He
Right.
introduced one piece of legislation in the 1830s that had him literally laughed out of the room.
Yep. What was it?
He thought that women should have the right to vote. Henry Hunt was the first parliamentarian to introduce a measure for women's suffrage.
But the idea of getting this many people together for miles around was pretty unique, number one. Number two, there were a lot of people who piggybacked onto this, people who had a whole list of different rights that they wanted to ask for.
We saw something like that here in Washington a few years ago when you had the Women's March. But you had environmentalists getting out and saying, hey, we're supporting women, but we want our voice heard too. So you had, tens of thousands of people here at the Women's March, things like that. So I think that's not unusual. But one of the things that Henry Hunt said was, people will be unarmed.
Mhm.
I will not speak to an armed crowd.
Right.
And I believe, I have not found evidence of any other large-scale, we will resist all violence events since ancient times.
Right.
There was the Roman, the secessio plebeius, which was unarmed, but which is a totally different story. We're going to do it in a future show, I hope, because that's really cool. But anyway, this was a big deal. And we know, as I said, that Gandhi was influenced by this, that several other people, that Leo Tolstoy, the author, was in many ways the father of nonviolent resistance in our culture, opposition to slavery.
Basically, it was a new idea. And to the city fathers, their experience was with violent mobs. And so to have a mob or a group that was going to stand there quietly and listen to speeches was something.
This is something that I was debating with you earlier. Is it really appropriate to call it the Peterloo Massacre, or was it just a matter of a group of soldiers who lost control? Part of this was you did send the army to do the job of police.
Because there were no police.
Not in the way we think of them, no. But was this just a stupid mistake like Kent State?
Mm-hmm.
And the answer is no. At Kent State, they didn't chase people down and shoot them in their dorm rooms. There were people on horseback who chased people into houses and hacked them to pieces.
Yes, they had blocked exits, the exits to the area so that people could not get out. And we have problems with numbers for some very unusual reasons. If you showed up at a doctor needing to have a very large cut on your arms or your head sewn up before you went to work the next day, they could probably guess where you were, and you would be arrested as being one of the
ostracized. There were no criminal prosecutions of protesters except for Hunt. And Hunt and a gentleman by Samuel Bamford, who was on the stand with him.
Right.
Henry Hunt wrote his memoirs while he was in prison, and he describes this event in tremendous detail. Although he says he figures there were 150,000 people there, I don't think they would have fit in that square. The 60,000 figure is kind of accepted by historians, and that is a huge number of people.
It's a very impressive number.
That's Yankee Stadium.
Yeah.
I think. Somebody's going to quote me on that and say, you're wrong.
It's bigger than RFK Stadium.
Okay. That's a huge crowd of people to be gathered, to be nonviolent.
And men, women, and children. It was not just working men. It was men, it was women, and it was children, all dressed up in their best clothes. That was part of a planned movement here.
Respect.
Was that they were going to act respectfully. And in fact, when Henry Hunt is starting to talk, they had 11 bands there playing music, which was crazy. But they wanted to show that they were still very loyal Brits. And they sang "God Save the Queen."
King.
Yes. Sorry. It's easy to make that mistake.
Okay. There's several other things to get out here. This is a topic that touches on so much that, believe me, we spent half the day today just throwing. We're not going to talk about that.
We're not going to spend half the day as what went into it, what came out of it.
Okay.
And it's
part of the reason for starvation in 1819 was a volcano blowing up in Indonesia. I think that's probably getting a little far off track of what we're talking about. It was a real fact. It really did lead to make the starvation problem worse.
It led to what is known as the summer without the year without a summer. In fact, it would affect a certain couple.
All right, see, you're doing it.
Two
You're
couples.
doing
I'm
it.
doing it.
That's a different
Anyway,
story.
that's a different story.
Yes.
Sorry.
Percy Shelley had some recollections of that.
See, now you
All right.
call me so that you could tell the story. You dirty scumbag. Anyway.
So one of the things that's fascinating is this is a souvenir chamber pot. It's not a chamber pot, I call it that.
It's not a chamber pot.
But they made medallions, they made memorabilia of the event, and then there were posters, which we showed some of them in the video. You can see these.
This is exaggerated. They did not, the constabulary did not use axes. They used sabers. There is some, I don't know what the reference is here. They're hearkening to something else. I'm not a total expert on all of the different symbolisms, but those sure look like butcher's axes to me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and the idea of they were butchering people like you would butcher animals.
Yeah, there would have been more than 18 people killed if it had been quite that violent. But this is actually part of a curious reason why Peterloo is so remembered in the United Kingdom, even if we don't talk about it much in America, which is another one. And I love this child screaming to the soldier, "Please, sir, don't kill my mommy. She's only came here to hear Mr. Hunt."
Looking over the coroner's reports and the various other reports, they found that the soldiers had a tendency to aim towards women and children. More women and children were killed than men.
We actually found something else, which was in I was reading a newspaper account in the Manchester Observer, which was a very left-wing newspaper that organized the event, and they were the ones who first started calling it the Peterloo Massacre.
Right.
But there was a description of women from the town shouting down the women who were on the platform,
right,
saying, "Go home, leave this thing to your sons and husbands."
Right. That it was quite scandalous. I would imagine the women who were doing the shouting were probably middle class.
Yes, the comment says that the women who were arriving to protest were from the lowest class of society.
And in the Industrial Revolution, that was extremely important.
You work for a living.
Yeah. When you get to the middle class, it's important to them to separate themselves both from nobility, which were a bunch of layabout drunk people having sex all the time, and the lower classes, which were questionable because it was men and women working in factories. Middle class mores and ethics and that whole code of the middle class, where you got your position through hard work and going to school and luck and pluck. You were self-made men.
We still have that repeated, that chance,
yes,
that if you work for a living, if you're in a union, you don't deserve to own
right,
a home or have these things.
Right.
These ideas are still with us.
Sure, yeah.
I had something else. Okay, but it's all good. There's so much information here. So I was trying to talk about the media.
Mm-hmm.
Peterloo was also unusual in that the organizers, and it was really organized. Okay, I didn't mention this before. You mentioned it in the video. People went out and they drilled in nonviolent resistance.
Yeah.
They
marched and drilled.
The Parliament basically said they went out and they were doing military-style drills, which is why one of the 6 acts said no drilling.
Right.
Because the story got circulating that they were drilling to plan an armed insurrection. One report said they were armed. The truth is, many of the men were carrying clubs.
No, they were carrying canes.
And walking sticks.
Because
they had walked 30 miles to be there.
Right, yeah. Some of these people had come from extremely long ways away.
And when you dressed up, you often carried a cane in those days. But anyway, so the way they brought in reporters from Liverpool, from London, from Gloucester, I believe, several places. And so there are newspaper reports that immediately got out. And this is significant. And this is part of making
immediate for early 19th century, which meant it traveled as quickly as a horse could.
It was like 5 days.
Yeah.
Which is pretty good.
Yeah.
It's 200 miles from Manchester to London.
Right.
But so this is part of making nonviolent resistance work, is you need to get the media out. The media needs to know if 17 people or 18 people are killed, and nobody knows about it, does it make a sound?
Yeah, what's the point?
But this became memorialized. We're going to talk a little bit, I hope, about the outcomes. I wanted to talk about one of the other issues at the time was slavery. And Britain still had slaves in its colonies in the Caribbean. They still had some slaves in mainland Britain, but they were not common, partly because there were so many people. You don't need a slave. You can just grab a child off the street.
Indentured servitude.
Yes. But we have today a surviving banner that was actually made up very shortly afterwards and used in other marches, because there were other marches that followed this, which I'm going to find here. I'm going to share a satire with you first. This was a published poem. This is the house that Jack built. This is the wealth in the house that Jack built. Notice Magna Carta, the Bill of Rights, which was a big deal. This is the vermin that plunder the wealth that lay in the house that Jack built. And this is the thing that poisons the vermin that plunder the wealth that live in the house that Jack built. Very direct. So political satire, printing press, very much a part of getting the word out.
And part of the story. But they also printed up handkerchiefs. And
yes, one of the images that we show. Well, I mentioned this
and tea towels.
This is a medallion.
And medallions, and they were passed around from one place to another. So
this is a banner that was made right afterwards. This is believed to be the oldest surviving political banner in the world. Skelmanthorpe, I believe, is a small town.
It's a small town.
Not rest until the suffrage being anything but universal. Okay.
Truth and justice pouring balm into the wounds of the
Manchester sufferers.
Manchester sufferers.
Okay.
But it is the figure down below in the corner, the man in chains.
Josiah Wedgwood.
Yes. Josiah Wedgwood is not the man.
No. Josiah Wedgwood isn't even the artist, actually.
Yeah, Josiah Wedgwood was the man who ran the Wedgwood factory, known for its beautiful porcelain.
Still is today.
But in the very early 19th century, Wedgwood was an adamant abolitionist. And he wanted to do something to raise money for the abolitionist movement. And he created a beautiful ceramic pin with a black slave in chains that said, "Am I not a man and your brother?" And Wedgwood sold these to raise money for abolitionist movements, and women wore them as a political statement. They are fascinating. They're worth a huge amount of money.
Well, the originals are, they're replicas. It's also kind of frowned upon because it's a condescending image of an African American.
Yes, it's a very condescending image, but that is, this poster is changing the color of the supplicant in it and using the same, even the same.
I didn't catch that. I didn't realize that that's supposed to be a white guy.
Yes, that's supposed to be a white guy, and he's saying, "Am I not a man and a brother?" So this is actually taken from an abolitionist's.
I didn't realize that. I was thinking abolition was part of the issues that they were talking about. So
it is. But
okay, well, it was, and yes, and it became important. One of the problems was the abolitionists. The leader of the abolitionists, William Wilberforce, was very anti-women's rights. So there was a lot of friction. One of the things when you have any movement going. Okay, right. It is now 5 minutes to 8.
Right.
We've been told that there are other shows about to go on that we have promised to get out.
We've got John Peterson and Nakasuchi. So definitely look that one up. That's promising to be a good show tonight.
If you guys are still watching, John, oh no, he did leave. Okay, but I would like to make a few comments in wrap up.
Right.
Because again, we could talk for another 2 hours about this, and I've got more pictures. But so one of the outcomes was immediately there was repression of the movement. It was squashed. About 15 years later, you had the Chartists movement, which got going.
It was a petition drive. They had put out 3 separate petitions, one in 32, one in 37, and one in 48. The Chartist movement in 48, they had a large gathering in London, but they had spread a petition around and got 6 million signatures asking for the right
This is
to
the
vote.
Chartist gathering in London.
There's the
That's an actual
1848.
photograph, a
Yeah.
very, very early photograph with recognizable people in it.
But you can see the
Oh, wait, that's Nelson's column, isn't it?
no, that's a
A smokestack?
that's a smokestack.
All right.
Even
all right.
though they're marching on
So
London.
the Chartists made progress, and it led to some electoral reform. Unfortunately, the Chartists were at times violent. They were suppressed violently. And it was really not until the 1860s that we got real reform in parliamentary districts. And
we will get England will get parliamentary reform bills in 1832, but the really big ones came in 1867, that is when we see universal male suffrage, or close to it. When they get rid of the
property requirement?
property requirements.
Okay,
Thank
and
you very much.
As I've mentioned, and I think this is important, America in 1819 had property owning requirements in most states too.
Right.
And that's a whole different story. It's huge.
The Corn Laws will not be repealed until 1846.
I thought it was in the 30s.
Nope, 1846.
One of the interesting things is there's a gentleman who was, following in the immediate aftermath of Peterloo, there was a group called the Cato Street Conspirators who came up with a plan. I have a picture of them somewhere.
It's okay, Jerry.
Okay, they came up with a plan to kidnap the prime minister and many of his other ministers and hack their heads off.
It was a real conspiracy to kill people.
Turns out that they were set up, that they were told that I'll be meeting there somewhere. The guy who said, hey, let's do this and push them to it was a police or whatever the equivalent of police informant. And that didn't go so well, but it told Parliament these 6 acts are necessary to preserve the Union. But one of the gentlemen who was in Parliament at this time was in charge of some financial things, was the guy who repealed the Corn Laws eventually, became prime minister, guy who pushed through Catholic emancipation, which is another topic we don't have time for. It's this gentleman. But Robert Peel, but Robert Peel's most significant thing, which I'm going to argue is in response partially to Peterloo, was he went to an empty field in London and he established an office for the first Metropolitan Police Force. The name of this field was Scotland Yard.
Scotland Yard.
And he created the modern police concept. The
Which
rules that police officers are supposed to follow, the idea that you don't send soldiers in who are going to hack people away, because these are guys from Waterloo. That's how they responded to things. You don't, and they get bloodlust, they get on a rampage, they get going. You train, you require them. I believe that Peel's work in this area was highly significant, made a difference. Policemen in London are still called
Bobbies,
in reference to Robert Peel. So I think that's one of the positive things that did come out of Peterloo. The other thing was, of course, that I think the Shelley poem helped communicate the message that you can stand there. There's more of you than there are of them. You know, we are many, they are few.
Ants and grasshoppers.
Yeah.
If you get the reference.
Yeah. And that has made the world a better. Nonviolent protesters aren't always in the right.
Nope.
You know, but I personally think it's important. It's made this. Okay.
Pretty impressive thing to do.
Oh, we have a reference from Robert Fried about learning something more from us about Peterloo, and I'm going to try to put in the links below. The BBC Radio 4 did a wonderful 2-hour-long presentation on this, and they actually read from they read from Hunt's journal, and they talk about something which we don't even cover here, which was the balladeers, which were another part of the media, which were singers who would travel from town to town.
Anyway,
so we have to wrap it up.
Thank you so much for being here. We certainly appreciate you being here and seeing our travel.
Watching our travel pictures, yes. Hey, next week we're going to Pittsburgh. Look forward to that one.
No, we're not going to Pittsburgh.
Fine.
Anyway.
Reno. We're going to Reno. We'll have pictures of Reno.
Anyway, thank you very much for being here. We certainly appreciate you being here, and hope to see you soon.
And don't forget to share and enjoy. Good night, ladies and gentlemen.
Good night, everybody.